We're going to start by using watercolor, and we're going to start out in our sketchbooks again. So grab your sketchbook, turn to the next page. The last thing we did was the oil pastel ball, the sphere. So turn to the next page. Now hopefully you still have that piece of cardstock in your sketchbook that we had used, if you remember, all the way back when we were working on this, and I had you put this cardstock underneath it, because when you draw, a lot of times it bleeds through, and that piece of cardstock was to catch all of that so it didn't go on the page behind it. So you want to do that now and stick this piece of cardstock underneath here, because what we're about to do is definitely going to bleed through several pages of paper. So if you don't have this to put back here, you might want to just take this one piece of paper, fold everything else back, so you have just this one piece of paper to work on, so that you know, it won't bleed all the way through your book. Be careful though, and be aware of, you know, what you're working on. If you're working on a nice table, you are going to have something underneath it, because watercolors are known to stain. You might be able to get it off, you might not, but you really do need to have something under here to kind of catch that paint that goes through the paper, since it's so thin. We're going to do a few little techniques in watercolor. So grab a pencil. We are going to just draw some basic shapes, maybe a long rectangle, maybe a long triangle, maybe an oval, and I guess I can just repeat the same thing down here. What we're going to do is try to practice using our brush and having control with our brush, and learning how to go from dark to light or light to dark. So if you grab your watercolors, you should have a brush inside. It's got a little plastic case on it. You can take that and throw it away. You don't really need it anymore. And it should come to a good point. You're going to need to get a cup and just put some water in it. And then you're going to need your paint palettes. Okay, so of course you need the water to work your watercolor. And you'll notice when we start to practice that this paper might kind of get really wavy. This is not watercolor paper. When we go to do our project, you have paper that's a lot thicker that we're going to use, but we are just practicing, and I just kind of want you to get your hands in this and get a feel for it. So know that the paper it's really thin. You don't want to go over the same area a lot, because you can very easily just rub a hole through your paper. So be careful with that. All right, so the first thing I want to do is get my brush wet. And really you can pick any color at all. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to pick red since it's my first one here. And I just want to get that wet a little bit. Okay, kind of work that paint a bit. Okay, so now I'm going to get some more water on my brush. And what I want to do is start out just by getting the paper wet. Now I've already got a little bit of paint on my brush, and that's okay, but I'm really just trying to stay inside my lines and get this shape wet. And you'll get a feel for this. You don't want your paper too wet, because it'll bunch up and be hard to work with, but you don't want it to be totally dry. We want it to be a little bit wet. Okay, so I've done that. I'm trying my best to stay in the lines. I'm using the tip to get into those corners. Okay, now I'm going to go back and pull up a little bit of red. So now I'm going to go back and put this at the top. It's going to be real bright, and I'm trying to stay inside that line. Okay, so this end is going to be very red. or whatever color it is that you chose. Now see how I'm getting that straight edge? Notice I have my brush touching that line and I'm just pulling it down. You don't want to pick it up, because if you pick it up and put it back down, you're not going to get a straight line. So if you're working on your edges, as soon as you put that brush down, don't pick it up. Just watch it touch that edge as you pull down. And if you find that you're starting to run out of paint, then you can pick it up if you need to. All right, so I'm going to really load the paint down here on this end. But what I want to do is start fading it out to make it lighter. And to do that, you just add water to what you already have. So let me dip back in my water and see how I'm pulling it down. And I'm not adding any more paint. I'm just pulling that color down with my brush and water, okay? So I want you to practice that same thing with a different color in these other two shapes. Okay, and now just with water. Okay, and you'll start to notice it's starting to kind of bubble up a little bit. That's okay. When we go to do this on the other paper, hopefully it won't do that too much. All right, now for the last one. Now just with the water. Now this color is really dark and so it's not transitioning here really well. So what I'm gonna do is bring this down as much as I can, making sure I get the edge, but I'm gonna go back and add a little bit more paint in here so that it's smoother. That's too much of a jump. These are much smoother than this. So I'm gonna add just a little bit of paint in here, adding more water to try to get that to blend in. Now, there's a big lump right here, so it's starting to pool down here and here, but with this paper, I'm gonna just try to do, the best that I can. Now that was a bit much, so while it's still wet, I'm gonna try to spread that out a little bit. So that's why we're practicing. Okay, and I know there's a little, that's kind of light right there, but there's a lump because when the paper gets wet, it starts to expand, and that's when it starts getting wavy. When it dries, it will flatten out a little bit more. Okay, so now for the bottom, what we're gonna do is this time we're gonna practice going from one color into another color, okay, with both. So when you do that, you have to go back and remember how the color wheel works, because we're going to be blending analogous colors, okay? So remember, analogous colors are the colors that are next to each other. So blue and green are analogous, yellow and green, analogous, yellow and orange, analogous. So colors that are next to each other blend really well together. So that's what you're gonna do with your watercolor. So you can blend, this is really dark, but it's violet. So you can blend violet and blue or violet and red. You can blend blue and green or blue and violet. Green and blue or green and yellow, okay? So they kind of go together, yellow and orange, or yellow and green, orange and red, or orange and yellow. Okay, so let's go back. Now we're gonna start out just like we did before, where I'm gonna start with getting it wet, starting with a color, pulling it out with water, and then I'm gonna stop. And then I'm gonna come back here and do it with the next color in reverse. Okay, so again, you can pick whatever color you want. You just gotta make sure they're analogous colors. If your water ever gets dirty or it starts to, look kind of muddy, you can always just dump it and refill it. Let's see, I guess I'm gonna go with orange and yellow. I haven't used either one of those yet. So I'm gonna start with my orange. Or I did not get it wet. Let me go ahead and just get this wet a little bit, not too much water. Trying to stay in the lines, because if I stay in my lines now, when I put my color on, it should stay in the lines. it goes wherever the water is. So if I was to get out of the lines right now, when I paint my color, the color's gonna bleed out. So you have to be careful with the water, even though it looks like you're not really doing anything. You're just getting it wet. You still have to be careful to stay inside that line. All right, now I'm gonna start with my orange, get it really thick down here. Trying to stay in the lines, using that tip in the corners, laying my brush down, pulling it down without picking it up, just watching it touch that line. Okay, I'm gonna kind of fill this in, add a little bit more up here to make it really dark. And then about here, I'm just gonna start adding water. But I'm not gonna go down all the way. I just kind of wanna pull it down a little bit so it starts to fade out. You gotta work quickly. Watercolor, when it dries, it'll create lines. Okay, so that's pretty good. So it's fading out. Now I'm gonna go the opposite way. I'm gonna start with yellow, clean my brush off. Whenever you go from one color to another, you really wanna clean that brush. So now I'm gonna go heavy down here with yellow. Okay, and then I'm just gonna bring it up and I'm gonna let them mix together in the middle. And again, my paper is getting kind of wavy, so they're pooling in the low areas and the lighter areas are where it's kind of coming up, the paper. But you know, just do the best you can. We're just kind of practicing blending because it's good to figure that out now instead of on the project. Okay, same thing with different colors in the other two shapes. Just to add water here to get them to blend while it's still wet, so I can try to get rid of those hard lines so it's a soft transition. Okay, and then water, just water. Get that to blend together. Okay, and now just water to pull it down. And now just water to pull this up. It's so dark, it's gonna need a lot of water. Okay, now you can see where it's pooling and getting darker where the paper's going down, and it's lighter where it's coming up, and that's okay. You know, that was a good practice, just to practice blending. Okay, so now I want you to take a picture of your sheet and put this in Google Classroom so that I can give you credit for it. Leave this out to dry. You don't want to close your book yet, because if you were to close your book, this, once it dried, would stick to your paper. You can go ahead and pour this out. Rinse your brush under clean water, and then make sure it comes back to a point. It might be stained, but that's okay. You know, as long as you run it and the water comes out clean, it's okay. Make sure it comes to a point and just lay it sideways to dry. You can go ahead and put it back in here if you want. And that's it. Just make sure you post this in Google Classroom so that I can give you credit. All right.